The rain was falling in heavy sheets, blurring the world into streaks of grey and silver. The wipers on Caleb Morris's old blue pickup squeaked back and forth, barely keeping up as he leaned forward, squinting through the downpour. He was exhausted, his clothes still smelling faintly of motor oil from the mechanic shop where he'd spent the entire day under cars that weren't his. In the back seat, his 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, was asleep under a thin blanket, clutching her worn-out teddy bear. It had been another long day, barely enough money for groceries, let alone the rent that was 3 days late. Caleb's mind was a whirlpool of unpaid bills and quiet worries when his headlights caught something ahead. A lone figure on the roadside, drenched, struggling to fix a flat tire. The woman was shivering beside a silver sedan, hair plastered to her face, her hands trembling as she tried to loosen the bolts. Caleb hesitated for a second. Most people would have kept driving in weather like this, but that wasn't who he was. He sighed, pulled over, and stepped into the cold rain, his boots splashing in muddy puddles. Before the story continues, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of helping a stranger, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Journal. Every act of compassion counts, and your support helps stories like this reach more hearts. Caleb approached her and spoke over the sound of the storm, asking if she needed help. The woman looked up, startled but relieved. Her name was Elena Hart, and she was on her way to a nearby town for a business meeting when her tire blew. Her phone had died, and not a single car had stopped for over 30 minutes. She tried to apologize for being a burden, but Caleb just smiled tiredly and said, "No one's a burden in the rain." Within minutes he was kneeling in the mud, loosening the bolts, his hands numb from the cold. Elena tried to help, holding the flashlight from his toolbox, watching. This stranger who worked with quiet efficiency, saying nothing about the weather or the mess. When he finally finished, he stood up drenched to the bone, wiping rain from his face. She thanked him and he simply nodded, saying, "Just get home safe." She offered him money for his trouble, but he shook his head. "I've got a little girl sleeping in the truck, just wanted to help." He gave a small wave, turned back toward his old pickup, and drove away before she could say another word. Elena watched his taillights fade through the rain, something heavy stirring in her chest. Caleb didn't think much more about it. Life for him was always a struggle to keep going, to keep food on the table and Sophie smiling. His wife, Nora, had passed away 2 years ago after a long illness that drained their savings and left him with nothing but debt, and a little girl who still asked sometimes why Mommy never came back. Every day he worked double shifts at the auto shop and took side jobs fixing broken engines in neighbors' driveways just to scrape by. But even in his exhaustion, he always made time to sit beside Sophie's bed, read her favorite story, and kiss her forehead goodnight. The days blurred into weeks. Then, one morning, as Caleb was tightening bolts under a client's truck, his manager came out with a strange look on his face. "Morris, there's someone asking for you out front," he said. Wiping his hands, Caleb walked out and froze. Standing there in the sunlight was the same woman from that rainy night, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. Elena smiled warmly and said, "I hope you remember me." She explained how she had been stranded that night and how he'd stopped when no one else did. Caleb nodded, a bit embarrassed. "Just did what anyone would have done," he muttered, but Elena shook her head. Not everyone would have. She handed him a business card that read Hart Automotive Group, Regional Director. She told him her company was opening a new restoration division focused on rebuilding classic cars and offering opportunities to experienced mechanics who had an eye for detail and a heart for honest work. "I asked around about you," she said. "Everyone in this town says you're the best with an engine and the most honest man they know." Caleb blinked, unsure how to respond. He'd never been offered anything that sounded remotely like hope. Elena smiled again and said softly, "Come in for an interview tomorrow. No promises, but I think we could use someone like you." That night, Caleb sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the business card like it was a ticket to another world. Sophie sat across from him, coloring in her notebook. "What's wrong, Daddy?" she asked. He smiled, brushing her hair gently. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. Maybe things are about to get better." The next day, he showed up at the Hart Automotive Group's regional office, nervous in his only decent shirt. Elena greeted him warmly and introduced him to a few executives. What he thought would be a 5-minute conversation turned into an hour-long discussion about engines, innovation, and how small-town mechanics saw cars not as machines, but as stories worth saving. By the end of the week, Caleb was officially hired, not as a regular mechanic, but as a lead specialist in the new restoration program. His first paycheck was more than what he used to make in a month. He finally caught up on rent, replaced Sophie's torn shoes, and even fixed the leaky roof. It felt surreal. For the first time since Nora's passing, he could breathe. But what touched him most wasn't the money, it was Elena's continued kindness. She would sometimes visit the shop, not as a boss, but as a friend. She talked to Sophie, brought her small gifts like coloring books and snacks, and often reminded Caleb that what he did that night wasn't just fixing a tire. It was restoring her faith in humanity. Months passed, and life bloomed again in the Morris household. Sophie began to laugh more, humming little songs as she played on the porch. Caleb's eyes no longer looked tired. They carried a quiet light of gratitude. He started fixing up an old 1965 Mustang that had been sitting abandoned behind the shop, saying it was something he and Sophie could work on together someday. Then one afternoon, as Caleb was closing up the shop, Elena stopped by. She looked different, pensive, thoughtful. "Can we talk?" she asked. They sat on a bench outside under the warm glow of sunset. Elena shared that she had once been in a very dark place herself, having lost her own family years ago in an accident. "That night in the rain," she said, voice trembling slightly, "I wasn't just stranded on the road, I was stranded in life. You reminded me that kindness still exists, that strangers can still care." Caleb looked at her, deeply moved. "Guess we both needed a little saving that night," he said quietly. Elena smiled through her tears. "I think we did." Over time, their friendship grew into something deeper, not rushed or dramatic, but steady and real. Elena became part of their small world, joining them for Sunday dinners, helping Sophie with her school projects, laughing over burnt pancakes and spilled orange juice. Sophie began to see her as someone who brought light back into their home. Caleb, though hesitant at first, realized he hadn't smiled this freely in years. One spring morning, as cherry blossoms fluttered across the driveway, Elena surprised Caleb with something that left him speechless. She handed him a set of keys and led him outside to see the old 1965 Mustang, now fully restored, shining under the sunlight. The same car he had been slowly working on in his spare time. "Consider it a thank you," she said softly, "for stopping that night, for being who you are." Caleb ran his hand along the polished surface, unable to speak. His eyes filled with tears as Sophie hugged his leg, squealing in excitement. That car wasn't just metal and paint. It was proof that his kindness, his small act on a rainy night, had come full circle. The local news eventually picked up the story. Mechanic helps stranger in rain, finds new life in return. People from all over town stopped by to congratulate him, to remind him that good deeds had a way of returning home. And in that moment, standing beside the woman whose life had intertwined with his, Caleb realized something profound. Sometimes the universe doesn't reward kindness with grand miracles, it rewards it with people. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, and share this video to remind others that compassion still changes lives. And don't forget to subscribe to Kindness Journal, because every true story of humanity deserves to be heard. Before we end, take a moment and comment below. Have you ever helped a stranger who ended up changing your life in return? Your story might inspire someone who needs a little hope today. And as the camera fades on Caleb, Sophie, and Elena driving down that open country road in the shining Mustang, the words linger softly in the narrator's voice. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness writes the biggest chapter of your future.